Okay. Gosh, Danielle. Oh, should I call you? What should I call you? Danielle? I mean, you want to be in your Dr. Danielle?
No, I can just be Danielle.
I like Dr. Danielle. Hi,
Dr.
Dr. Danielle. I always feel like I should be, because I have such FOMO, which we can talk about the genetic predisposition to FOMO today if we want to also, but I have such FOMO because I love my listeners so deeply, and just the best stuff comes up before we're, in the pregame. So what I want to just say to everybody listening is I'm so sorry. We were just chatting, me and Dr. Danielle. And I said, oh my God, I got to get this recorded this minute. So hi, can you just give us the little I obviously just read your bio to everybody, but just give us the little rundown of like who you are, what you're interested in, and what you're going to break down for us today.
Yes. So my background is in psychology and genetics, and I run an addiction research center up at Rutgers University.
I love language.
Broadly, I'm interested in why some people are more at risk for substance use disorders and other kinds of mental health challenges than others. And so I do everything from big gene identification projects, trying to understand the underlying biology and why some people are more at risk, to studies of kids and what do kids who are carrying genetic risk factors look like as they're growing up, and what kinds of environments exacerbate risk or help reduce risk. And then we try and use all of that to develop more tailored and effective prevention, intervention, and treatment. So that's what I do in a nutshell.
So basically, this is the kind of podcast, and I had this thought before we even got on the call today, but this is the kind of podcast that you want to pen and you probably want to listen to 2 or 3 times, because I have so many questions about the scope of the work that you do. And so like the first thing I want to ask about, because, okay, so in my line of business, I work with a lot of people who moralize, they create a moral reasoning around their suffering, right? Like, why me? If I just worked a little harder. So my first question I have, which I'm sure you're just going to shed so much light on, like you research how genes influence human behavior. And so when it comes to addictions, eating disorders, disordered eating, all the things in between, what is your take on willpower being a method of solving problems?
I am so glad you asked that question. And one of the reasons I am passionate that though I am a scientist and a researcher, we have to get out of the lab and talk to people more often, is because this issue of our passing judgment on people who are struggling, whether it's on ourselves,
oh my gosh,
why can't I just stop drinking, stop eating so much, whatever it might be, or our passing judgment on other people that we see out there. Why can't that person snap out of their depression? Why can't they just stop using drugs or stop eating so much or don't go to McDonald's so much? Whatever all
just
those
take a 10-minute walk, right?
That we hear, exactly. We attribute a lot more to willpower. The idea that people, it's all their quote fault or their choice, then the science actually supports. And by that, what I mean is not that genes are destiny, that DNA is destiny, that we don't have an active, important role in our life outcomes, but very often we completely ignore the really important role of genes in so much of human behavior, whether that's parenting and our kids' behavior, or whether that's reflecting on our own behavior and what we see as our shortcomings or things we wish were different about ourselves and just don't understand why we can't, quote, get our act together or whatever it might be. And what we know is that we are all born with a unique genetic code. In the same way that we can look around and see all the amazing differences between people on the outside, our brains are all wired very differently on the inside as well. And that makes, it very different for each of us in terms of how we process risk and reward and how impulsive we are or how emotional we are. And so a lot of that is actually hardwired. It isn't that we're all blank slates and we can just make ourselves into exactly the people that we want to be. Of course, we can play a role in that, but I think too often people judge themselves or others for things that, in many ways are not fully under their control.
That's so interesting. I mean, what I hear over and over again is, I just need to try harder. I just need to push myself more. I mean, we were having this conversation before this, even about how, you versus your husband experiences illness. Me and your husband are more like, I'm just going to push through this, always to my detriment. Right. And I think even when I used to be in addiction, if I said, oh, I'm just going to try to eat less and I'm going to try to starve myself because I just had this binge, or things with drinking, whatever. And the willpower model never worked for me. Can you break that down? Why trying harder maybe isn't going to be a great solution?
One of the reasons I think it's so important to recognize that our genes are important is because I think it helps give ourselves a little more space to breathe. And by that, I mean a little less judgment. It allows us to become more curious about it, as opposed to looking at something as, why can't I? Why can't I? It's instead isn't that interesting how I feel a compulsion to do whatever this is? Or I swore I was going to stop, fill in the blank, drinking, getting so upset about things, overeating. And yet even though this is very important to me, I wasn't able to do it.
Mm.
And when we can stop and kind of think about how our brain works from almost the perspective of a scientist and approach it with curiosity, of course, that's where also strategies like mindfulness and things that we know are effective in helping manage both addictive disorders and other mental health challenges. That's one of the reasons they're so effective, is because, our brains are wired in all kinds of ways that don't help us many times. Whether it's just kind of humans generally, there's all sorts of evolutionary ways that our brains, they evolved for our situations from millions of years ago.
Wait, can we talk about that though? Because I read this meme. I think that's how you say it. I read this meme and it said, and it really resonated with me, but I really want the science on it. And it said, your brain wants your brain wants you safe. It doesn't care if you're happy. And I was like,
I love that.
Isn't that good? But can you unpack that for us? Cause I was just like, I'm just a little therapist over here. I want the real brain science on it.
Yeah. So if you think about, there's often what's called the selfish gene, meaning the only thing genes care about is passing themselves on. That's the way evolution kind of works, right? It doesn't care about, are we happy? Are we fulfilled? Are we this? And if you think about humans as they have existed for tens, hundreds of thousands of years, the key pieces are really survival and, essentially finding a mate, having offspring, continuing the human race. Those are all very important things. But many of the characteristics that can either be very challenging for us to manage, or candidly, if you're a parent, can be challenging to manage in your children. And the things that can put us at risk for, say, addictive disorders, things like impulsivity, risk-taking, or on the other hand, some anxiety or emotionality. Mm-hmm. Well, there are not so good things associated with that. And often we don't like those traits because we think the impulsivity, why am I having trouble stopping eating, stopping drinking, et cetera. Right. Or the emotionality. Why do I get so anxious about things? I really want to be able to enjoy my life more fully. Why am I so nervous about those things? Well, a little bit of those things is actually a good thing. There's good things that come along with those traits. So risk-taking, impulsivity. Well, you used to have to leave your tribe to find mates so that you could have children and there wouldn't be entirely inbreeding, which is not good for passing on genes in the human race. And so if everybody wanted to kind of stay put and there weren't risk takers, well, that wouldn't have been good for perpetuation of the species. It takes a risk taker to want to go out and hunt and chase down the animals and all of the things that were necessary. So many of these traits, which were really, really critical for our survival, well, now we're not necessarily trying to, hunt down our food or try
Right.
to, we still do need to leave the home at some point, but adolescence, which is kind of the height of risk taking, our adolescents aren't leaving to go find mates when they're 14 or 15 anymore. So instead, now what we have are, we're trying to manage all of this risk taking as parents, when evolutionarily it was very adaptive. And similarly, anxiety, that little part of your brain that is like, this is going to be dangerous, I need to be careful. Well, that can be protective in many ways. But when it starts spinning out of control, that's when it can lead to problems. So I always talk about dispositions are not in and of themselves good or bad. They serve purposes, but they can also cause challenges in our lives. So one of the things that we want to do is figure out our dispositions, and by understanding them, it can help us figure out, how do we bring out the best and how do we channel them for good?
I love that though. I mean, that's so deeply therapeutic, right? I mean, I feel like that's like literally what I do for a living, is help people access self-acceptance, self-forgiveness, like all of these skills. And you're saying that a lot of it, and I mean, I agree with this wholeheartedly, even just through my teaching with Marsha Linehan and dialectical behavioral therapy, that some of us are born more sensitive than others. I think sensitivity is a superpower, but that's just because I don't even have emotional sunscreen. I have to put on emotional sunscreen every morning, Dr. Danielle. I mean, it's a gig over here. For me to wake up in the morning is a gig.
It is. But I love the way that you frame that, because
it took years. That was practice, but it's exactly what you're saying. And I wonder if we could break it down for me, because it was an unmanageable thing to be me while I was pushing against it so much. You know what I mean? Like, I was too sensitive, and then that would lead me to harm myself. And it's like, to what end? I actually just started to practice in Buddhism, got into some 12-step groups. Like I learned it that way, but what is the science behind that? Because I think the question I get that really gnarls people in a tremendous way with addiction, and certainly with food stuff, is like, well, why me? Right? Yeah. Like, well, my sister can eat cake normally. Well, my husband just has one drink and it's no big deal. And then this is a paralyzing concept. So, how much does genetics play a role, and like, what do we do about it?
So for virtually any behavior, on average, about half of the differences between people, why your sister can eat cake and you can't, why you have trouble with alcohol and stopping, and someone else in your family or your friends don't, about half of the differences between people is due to differences in their genes. And the other half is found in all the kind of differences that can exist in our environments.
But what do we mean by differences in genes? Like, because even like we were talking about this beforehand, that I have, my best friend and her children, like there's 3 children and they're all so incredibly different. Like, and like, can you walk us through that? It is unfair. Like, and I'd like to say it is unfair that some people.
It is unfair. It is totally unfair. And that was going to be the next thing I was going to say. The reality is that life is unfair.
Ain't that the truth?
The genes that we are dealt, we are all at risk for something, but we are all at risk for different things.
Is that true, that everybody's at risk for something?
100%.
Huh. And what a great reframe.
Nobody has perfect DNA. I mean, some of us are more at risk for cardiovascular diseases, or for forms of cancer, or for diabetes. Other individuals are more at risk for substance use disorders, eating disorders.
And I think is it true? And also true, like emotion dysregulation. And by that, I mean, having what I call lacking emotional sunscreen. I mean, even that's on genes, right?
100%. And so one of the things that we know is, even though all of these things are strongly genetically influenced, it isn't as if you're inheriting a gene or a couple genes that predispose you to an eating disorder or to an alcohol use disorder or an opioid use disorder. That in fact, we know one of the big ways that our genes influence all these outcomes is by influencing the ways our brains are wired. And what that does is that influences our dispositional traits, our temperaments, the things that we call, risk taking or not. How extroverted or not are you? How emotional or sensitive or not are you? All behavior really falls on a bell curve. And there's thousands of locations in our genome, thousands of genes that contribute to where we fall. So we all, depending on what random half we get from our biological mom and what random half we get from our biological dad, we end up with kind of, probably some genes that might increase our risk for things and some genes that decrease it. And then they kind of average out to where we fall. And that's our natural tendency. It's your natural tendency toward how extroverted you are, how emotional you are, how impulsive you are. And then the really interesting thing about genes is that what those genes do is they influence those natural temperamental traits we all have. Yeah. And those traits then influence the way we interact with the world. So if you are more of a highly emotional person, then maybe you encounter a situation and it really deeply affects you in a way that somebody who's low on emotionality might brush it off. It doesn't even.
Yeah. I gotta say, and listen, I work hard on it, but I find those people I think you're one of those people. I find you are, I know it. I find people like you, like I'm in a safari. I'm like, how does that not bother you? I got to keep it locked up a lot of the time. I mean, in the years that I've sort of decided to be a healthy person, I've really learned how to keep it locked up, but I'm fascinated because my sunscreen is at such a low state that everything bothers me almost all of the time. And I'm actually interested. So for people listening, Dr. Danielle's book, The Child Code, is about raising children and rooted in the genetic codes of children. And it's fabulous. And I always love reading books like that, like for my inner child, because I imagine, obviously there are some kids and people and humans that struggle more with emotion than others. And some of this is due to genetics, and some of it is due to parenting. And I imagine the parenting style that was used on me, which was something to the tune of get over it, Molly.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I don't think that's an effective parent. My mother's listening. She's going to be like, why? Stop talking about me. Just every day, Molly, can you just stop talking about me? But what can parents do? And honestly, what can we do as if you don't have children or you're kind of done with that part of your life, what can we do internally to help highly emotional people that isn't, get over it? Stop being so dramatic, Molly.
Yes. I know my mother always says, I get blamed for everything now, whether it's your upbringing or your genes.
And in fairness, Danielle, God bless my mother. Because the bigger I get, the more, and she's the most private person in the world, poor thing. I mean, so she's getting her due, Yes.
So the reason that I wrote this book is because one of the things when I had a child, when I was raising my son, I found myself raising the challenging child that I study. Highly impulsive, highly emotional.
That's a story. Really? I love this story.
And I found the research to be my lifeline because I knew, okay, I have not done something to make my child so overly emotional and really, unable to manage the smallest kind of thing. So highly emotional kids are the ones that seem to get upset over quote unquote nothing.
Right.
1 minute.
People, right? I mean, I would say even for someone listening without kids, in general, I don't know if it's just kids.
Absolutely.
I'm 44 years old. I could struggle with this.
It's not just kids. It's traits that we all differ on. And so kind of big dimensions that we all differ on that play a big role in how we move through the world. And if you're a parent, how your child moves through the world. Are extroversion. So how much we enjoy being around other people and draw energy from that versus how much we really enjoy more quiet time and a smaller number of people. That actually has pretty profound effects on how we set up our lives, how we enjoy our lives, what parts of our lives we don't enjoy, whether there's matches or mismatches with our jobs, our environments, our partners, et cetera. The second one is really emotionality. We all vary a ton in our emotionality. So how quick we are to fear, frustration, or distress.
Hmm.
And kids who vary in this are the kids who, 1 minute they're coloring nicely and the next minute they've crumpled up their paper and thrown it on the ground and stormed off and slammed the door. And you're like, what just happened? We were having a lovely afternoon.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so a lot of parents struggle with that, with what's going on. And a default parenting style, as you were mentioning earlier, tends to be to clamp down on what often manifests as quote unquote bad behavior or misbehavior, right? You don't throw something down and storm out of the room. You don't slam the door. That's not okay. Whereas by understanding genes and what's causing a behavior, we can actually go a level deeper to, yes, okay, we might want to implement it's not okay to throw your things down and slam doors in this house. But when somebody's upset, that's not the time to have that conversation.
Fair.
It would be as if, when you're laying into your partner about how they promised they'd fold the laundry and it's still sitting on the couch a week later. And they're like, let's think about how to more productively discuss our differences. Right, they're like, no, I need to yell at you because I'm really upset right now.
We're throwing it down. It's interesting though, because I actually really do listen, I see this for those who are listening with parents, but if that's how you were parented, likely that's the critical voice inside of your head too. I can't tell you the amount of times where I'm having a big feeling and the critical voice comes into my head and says, God, get over it. God, this is not a big deal. And I've had to learn how to override that. And so I'm very curious about solution, obviously.
So
what do you do? What do we do with all of this?
That's such an important question. Our default, whether it's with ourselves or with our kids, tends to be to not like that behavior or the trait. And really, I think the solution is with kids, although I think it's true with ourselves too, we call it collaborative problem solving, right? Mm-hmm. So what you want to do is you want to get under the behavior to what's causing it. And that is those emotions, right? Those feelings that can be so big that they're hard to manage. It's the mean voice inside our heads, or in our kids, it's what was upsetting to them. Mm-hmm. And then it's really a matter of how do you learn to manage those feelings rather than that behavior. The behavior is a side effect of those underlying feelings. And so what you want to do is address how you're going to manage those feelings instead.
I want to really unpack this. I want to get super granular. So can you use an example, maybe that you have with your son where you use this in parenting, and then maybe we can use one, how we can do it with ourselves, because this is the key to all of it. Because I see this in my practice, right? It's somebody has a negative feeling. They're so ashamed, because it's primary emotion, fear. Fear turns into shame. They're ashamed that they're scared, or they're ashamed that they're sad. That shame turns into a maladaptive behavior of binging or yelling or shutting down or isolating or shopping or whatever it is. And that cycle's really hard to break out of. And at the end of it, they're bad or the child's bad or whatever. So I really want us to get granular of how we break out of this.
Yes, it's a great question. And as you said, once you get into those cycles, unfortunately, our brain, it tends to, canalize connections that are being made. And then it makes it more likely that
canalize connections. Wait, I need that in second grade over here.
Yes, exactly. I was talking to a friend about this the other day.
Did you see my face? I was like, didn't get that one on the SAT. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
If you imagine water flowing down the side of a mountain, it starts at the top and then it could go lots of different directions. But once it starts to go one direction, it's more likely to keep going in that direction.
Ooh, well-worn snow grooves. That's what I call it.
Yeah, it's deeper and deeper. Exactly. And that's what happens with our brain. Once something goes a particular direction, connections are made between that in our brain, and then it makes it more likely to go that direction.
So a shame response is like a canalized connection. So
exactly.
okay,
so
I'm here for this.
when you start to go down one pathway, so you have that shame response, you start to spiral. Why can't I change things? I'm not no good. I'm never going to get better, etc. Next time something happens, you slip up, you don't stick to your diet, your rules,
you scream
that
at
you had made
somebody. Yeah, I have
yes,
1,000 things
all
I could
those
put in
kind
that
of
category.
we slip up, we immediately go to that place that our brain is used to going to, because those connections have been made. But if we think about it as that water flowing down, it went one direction and that groove got deeper and deeper and deeper. But it doesn't mean that the water can't flow another direction. What we have to do is just be intentional to get it started that way. We have to dig a little trowel to get it to start a different direction.
How? Like, how would you do it? Like, I want you to walk me through this. Like, I'm all about being a second grader today. Walk me through this. Like, we are in second grade.
So I'll go back to the example of my son that you asked about.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we used to have trouble with was on Saturday mornings, I would plan all of these fun, special things we were going to do together. And we would be having breakfast and I would say, and guess what? Okay, pull on your shoes. We are going to go to the park, the museum, the festival, whatever it might be. And we're going to meet up with so-and-so and so-and-so and their kids and their kids. And it's going to be so much fun. And out of nowhere, he would, throw his shoe across the room and say, I'm not going, and storm upstairs. And, then that triggers the, you don't get to make that decision. Right. You are going, throwing the shoe is not okay.
This is fun. Right.
Down here. And then you can't make me, you're like,
the escalation.
It goes nowhere good. Right. So that is one example of now we are in a negative feedback loop here. It's not going anywhere good. So what you do is you want to step back and approach it with curiosity and with an intent to understand where is that behavior coming from, or where is that emotion coming from.
So how would you do it exactly? Like, I love that. So I love those two ideas with I love curiosity. It's a big thing, compassion, but compare curiosity and compassion. But I love this idea of an intent to understand. That's very, and because I think that's a beautiful self-reflection exercise. Why in the world would I be behaving this way? I ask that all the time in therapy. So with your son, like, how did you do that?
So one of the things that you want to do is to start by either talking to the individual again about the emotion and what's going on, as opposed to the behavior that you're not liking, that you're seeing. And so essentially, and with kids, sometimes you as the parent have to reflect a little bit on what's going on. Obviously, when it's yourself too, you want to approach it with curiosity and reflect on what's going on. What are the thoughts, or what was going on right beforehand that triggered that? So in this case, what had happened right before then? Well, I had said, we're going to the park with so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. That appeared to be the trigger. So you figure out, what are your triggers? Okay, that was the trigger. Why would that be a trigger? Right? What is it about that would be a trigger? Well, with my son, what I realized is I am the consummate extrovert, and he is far lower on that dimension. When you were talking about it's so foreign to imagine people who think a different way than you, that's a default we all have. We're all human beings. We only know the ways our brains work. And we assume that other people are thinking the same way that we are, that they have the same kind of experience and thought process. And the reality is very often that's not true. And that leads to tension with partners, tension with kids, tension with friends. Sometimes it's that we are assuming that we understand what someone else is thinking, when actually our brains all work so differently.
Well, it's an interesting thing too, that we're saying, because like my intent always is like, to not make things sound too easy. And yet there's something quite easy about what we're talking about here. And I've said, as an addiction therapist, my life, like, I think people undervalue vulnerability, right? Like, when it's cold out, Danielle, I'm vulnerable. Like I'm telling you, I'm just vulnerable. I'm vulnerable to yell at you. I'm vulnerable to shut down. I'm vulnerable to want to eat a lot of popcorn. But I know that about, and it's funny, like once I came to agreement with that, right? When I'm tired, like, and that is really simple to start to move towards accepting exactly who you are. I mean, it's an interesting thing. We're talking about genetic code, but we're really talking about self-acceptance, accepting you exactly as you are, as a solving of problems.
It's like trying to get water to flow upstream,
Right.
if we are working, the reality is we are all born with certain traits. Our kids are born with certain traits. We're born with certain traits. We can either work with them or we can work against them.
Well, right. It's like trying to make your kid love basketball when he just wants to go sing in the choir, right? Like,
absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is, whether it's with your children or whether it's with yourself, that the sooner you can get to the place where you realize, okay, there are just certain things about me. I might not even love them. They might not be my favorite. If I was molding myself from scratch, if I was
Might do it
molding my
differently.
child
Yeah.
from scratch, I would have chosen something different. But this is the way it is. And I understanding that it isn't just a matter of like, I did something wrong or, I wished I'd been a different way, but it's just, it was the genetic lottery. It was the luck of the draw, fair or unfair. We all inherited a code that we are starting our lives with and have walked around with our whole life. So recognizing, okay, what are the good things about those dispositional traits, because they all have good sides to them. You were talking about, you've converted, you now can see your emotionality as a superpower.
Oh,
that's a
completely.
beautiful
Although
way
sometimes I have to say, in fairness, because like honesty is my love language. Like, and sometimes I'm like, oh, come on, girl.
Absolutely. It's true. It's true of ourselves and it's true with our kids.
Right.
But
And sometimes even when I'm with the children I love the most, who I have a deep and profound respect for their emotional lability, sometimes I'm like, can we just get in the car?
yes,
sometimes,
100%.
or I find myself just saying, go to your room until you connect nice again. And that's not
Yes.
my best work, but I think isn't that a part of the whole thing, right? I think self-forgiveness and self-acceptance just go, and forgiveness and acceptance in general just go hand in hand.
100%. And when I talk to parents, I always say, don't beat yourself up as well when you're not your best parenting self. Let's be honest, when your kid's talking back or being defiant or being a brat or throwing a fit at Target or like, it is really hard to be like, I understand you're
this is the
really
genetic
upset right
code,
now,
this is their
right?
genetic code. It's okay.
Yes.
We're just going to
I
have a
do
big
have to have my
screaming fit.
mantra. I
What
do,
is your-
where I'm like, love the child hating the jeans right now. Love the child hating the jeans right
That's
now.
amazing. I think we could even use that personally. I mean, but I just have one more question. I mean, I have 1,000 more questions, but I had a teacher, and his big thing, and I heard you say this. I just want to hear it one more time. And he used to say, your biology is not your destiny. And I wonder what you think about that, because I think there is a part of listening to us talk where it's like, well, I'm just a highly emotional person, which for me, I know is true. And I know what I do with it, blah, blah, blah. And I think it's my destiny, and I don't think it's my destiny. I think they're both true, but I want to hear what you have to say about it.
Absolutely. I always say DNA is not destiny, but it's also not something to be ignored. And I think that embracing and just recognizing that fundamental biological fact, we all inherit natural tendencies, some of which we like and some of which we don't like. But again, we don't want to beat ourselves up about that, right? I think that by understanding that our children have their natural dispositions, we have their natural dispositions, it can help us with more self-acceptance. For me, that really is a game changer, to realize it's in my biology. That's where I'm starting from. But nothing about the way genes work suggests that it is destiny. So what we know is that we can also, work to channel our dispositions into different outlets, right? So risk takers are more likely to develop problems with addiction. but they're also more likely to be CEOs and entrepreneurs and fighter pilots.
I was having this thought because this is also where I take it. Like, so I come from a long line of alcoholics. My entire paternal, like my grandfather died at 50 of cirrhosis of the liver, my father, and I'm an alcoholic, but I'm a recovered alcoholic, right? So unlike the rest of my family, this is where I think biology is not destiny. And I wonder what you think about this. So I took a very different take on that diagnosis, right? Like I knew it was in my genes. I didn't care. I went through and when I realized it was a problem, I decided to take the emotional, spiritual, physical steps to put that into remission, unlike the rest of my family. And that I think is where I broke my genetic code or something like that. What do you think about that?
Oh, I love that. Breaking the code. That's wonderful.
Maybe
Yes.
your next book. It's on me. It's on the house.
I love it. Thanks, Molly. So you are 100% right that we all have these dispositions. And one of the ways that I think that can come into play when we're thinking about recovery and treatment is that we don't just want to address the one substance at hand, right? So if someone has a problem with alcohol, we obviously want to address what's going on with the use of that substance and using and, when reducing use, harm reduction type of techniques, abstinence, whatever that might be. But recognizing that we still have those dispositional traits that put us at risk that we actually know could show up in other ways if, for example, we don't have healthy coping strategies,
right,
and other ways to practice self-love and to deal with those impulsive tendencies or that critical voice, or we need essentially to address the underlying dispositional challenges in addition to just the behavior that might be in front of us.
And I think sometimes it can feel so overwhelming when you have this, the stacks of genes, like I do. Like I have the obesity gene. I have all the genes. I have the obesity genes. I have the suicide genes. I have the alcohol genes. And I think I could have a really different take on it, which could say, well, there they are. But instead I'm like, nope, not me. I'm going to do it differently, and that takes a lot of work. I think that's what I hear you saying.
It does. It absolutely does. And
But it's
so
much
when
better.
I think about
I
it,
mean,
it
far
is
better.
yes, some of us are unlucky in our genetic lottery that we draw, but then it's what you do with that, because those genes can unfold in many different ways and they can put you at risk for a number of things, but it doesn't mean you're destined to develop problems. And if you do develop problems, it doesn't mean that there aren't environmental ways to break those cycles.
Yeah. It doesn't mean the problems are unsolvable. Like,
Absolutely.
exactly.
So half of our differences are due to our biology, but the other half is differences in our environments, and recognizing how our dispositions can lead us into some of these unhealthy environmental situations and thought patterns and the way we carry them out. By understanding how our dispositions can lead us down some of these not so good paths, whether it's us, whether it's our kids, we also have the opportunity then to step in and break those connections.
Can you just say break those connections one more time? He just like had a nightmare. It was so cute. He was only 8 months.
That's very cute. Yes.
He's just like this. He's like, you tell like he just got totally shaken out of. That's his pit bull. That's his pit bull genetics.
Oh, yes. Dogs also are very different, have very different temperaments.
Oh, to say the least.
Talk about breeds having different
Yeah. And then you get a breed and it isn't the kind, it doesn't act in the way you think it is. Genetic code. There it is again.
It's all over. It's everywhere.
My office mate. So can you just, sorry, I forget what the word was. Do you remember the last sentence?
Break the code. It enables us to break the code.
Say it like in a good sentence.
I don't know. I'm like, what were we talking about again?
I know. It's a gnarly little bark my guy's got.
By understanding essentially the way our dispositions can lead us into different situations, which can sometimes be challenging and lead to problems. Understanding those risk pathways can also allow us to essentially break that code, to break that connection between our genes and what might be the challenges that they can lead to.
Amazing. So I asked this question and I'm fascinated to know what you think about it. The podcast is called What You're Craving. It talks about the underlying issues of addiction, eating disorders. And I wonder what you think we are really craving. I stumped the scientist.
That's such a great question, Molly. Interestingly, and this is going to get back to the fact that I studied genetics, I would guess that differs for everyone, and that there's no one size fits all right answer. And that is coming from me as the scientist, who there's certain things that I think are universals. We're craving love, we crave connection,
Safety,
but
right?
I also want to respect the fact that we are all different. I can't assume that I know how everyone else's brains work. And so the ultimate, most important thing that everyone craves is probably unique to that person as well.
That's my favorite answer thus far on the podcast, Dr. Danielle. So what we say in dialectical behavioral therapy, it depends. It depends. Yes. I love it.
It's amazing. It's true.
Love it. I'm so grateful. Thank you so much. I mean, I have a million more questions, but time is our great commodity. And I'm so, so grateful to have had you on the show today. Everybody go get that child code book. It is something else.
Thank you so much for having me. And yes, ultimately I wrote the book because I think that this is important information for parents to have as they're raising kids too, to help understand your kids' strengths and their dispositions and what they're potentially at risk for, so
and
that
teach them how to appreciate it too. I mean, I think a lot of our paths would be different if we had parents who did that, who knew better at the time, right?
Yes. So that's what I'm hoping to help parents do. Figure out how to accentuate their kids' strengths and reduce potential challenges and make our home lives easier along the way.
To say the least. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was a treat, a treat, a treat.
Thank you so much for having me, Molly.
Oh, wait, did I do it right? Hold on. Oh, I was just about to end. I'm going to end the meeting and I don't mean to. I know what I'm going to do. Just kidding.